This is Latter-day Presentations, where we discuss topics and issues of faith for Latter-day Saints. Welcome, friends. Are we a cult? Let's explore a common criticism of the faith of Latter-day Saints like me and you. Let's get started. Now, defining the term cult is kind of hard. When people hold different valid definitions for a term like cult, that means there's not an objective way to define it. And people's subjective definitions will be based on their own worldview and their own paradigms. And this is true of the term cult. Now, what do I mean by this? If I were to define a meter, it has a very simple objective definition. It's 100 centimeters, okay? Cult is different. There's not a universally agreed upon definition for this word. So a lot of people just kind of use it as sort of an insult toward organizations that they don't like. And that has led a lot of people to come to the point where they think the term is basically useless. And that's true of a lot of people in academia. Let's read some analysis from James T. Richardson. So he's an academic who studies the usage of the word cult. And here's what he says. He says, Troeltsch developed the term as something of a residual category in his theoretical scheme of religious forms in Western culture. Since then, the term has served as a rug under which were swept the troublesome and idiosyncratic religious experiences of mystics and other religious deviants. And he says, in recent years, the term cult has become a widely used popular term, usually connoting some group that is at least unfamiliar and perhaps even disliked or feared. He goes on to say, indeed, some would claim that the term cult is useless and should be avoided because of the confusion between the historic meaning of the term and current pejorative use. In other words, he's saying that a lot of academics and researchers and commentators have observed how the word cult is used in popular culture, and seeing how it's used, they've determined that it's no longer really useful. Now, I happen to disagree to some extent, and I'll tell you why. We do have legitimate examples of movements that have behaved in ways that are so unhealthy and destructive, right? And there are a number of these, and we do need a term to categorize these, right? So is the term cult useless? I would say no. There are some groups that we should call cults, even if some people might disagree about some of the particulars about why we use that term. I think that's important to distinguish these kinds of groups from healthy high demand systems. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. But let's explore a common model for determining whether something amounts to a cult. And it's called the BITE model. It was developed by a researcher named Stephen Hassan. And he has 4 basic groupings of control that an organization imposes upon its adherents. One is behavior control, another is information control, another is thought control, and another is emotional control. And so within these, you have all kinds of little elements of control that organizations impose upon their adherents. So some examples are under behavior control, we have regulate an individual's physical reality, dictate where, how, and with whom the member lives and associates or isolates. Under information control, we have encourage spying on other members. Under thought control, we have use of loaded language and cliches which constrict knowledge, stop critical thoughts, and reduce complexities into platitudinous buzzwords. That's not very... I don't know if that one is particularly useful. That sounds like really subjective. But anyway, but under emotional control, promote feelings of guilt or unworthiness, instill fear, and then extremes of emotional highs and lows, those kinds of things. So this is the BITE model. It's commonly invoked to criticize the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And a couple of good questions to ask about this are, where else besides religion do we see these things? So if we take the bite model and apply it to other areas of human activity, does it apply? And do we end up calling a lot of things cults, right? And are any of these behaviors actually good or helpful in some contexts and not others? There are organizations that really do need a lot of behavior control and information control, for example. Now, as they exercise that control, does that amount to cult behavior, or is it just normal behavior for an organization that has their mission and their need to achieve things in a certain way? So these are good questions to ask. But let's actually look at some other areas of human experience and see how the bite model might correspond. And let's start with academia. So here we have a quote from Karen Kelsky. And she says, academic careers are the same. What starts out as an inspired quest for new knowledge and social impact can devolve into endless days in an airless room, broke, in debt, staring at a computer, exploited by departments, dismissed by professors, ignored by colleagues, disrespected by students. It is okay to decide that's not what you want. It is okay to make another choice. There is life outside of academia, but academia is a kind of cult, and deviation from the normative values of the group is not permitted or accepted within its walls. You will be judged harshly by others, and to the extent you've been properly socialized into the cult during graduate school, by your own inner voices. Making the decision to leave involves confronting that judgment, working through it, and coming out the other side. It is long and hard and involves confronting profound shame. I went through this. I know. Now, if we look at a couple of elements of bite that correspond to what she's saying here, we have manipulate and narrow the range of feelings. Some emotions and or needs are deemed as evil, wrong, or selfish. So here she's actually inviting people to do something different and not consider their emotions wrong or selfish. She's saying it's okay to feel things that you're feeling if you want to leave academia. So she's kind of deprogramming. And another one is teach emotion stopping techniques to block feelings of homesickness, anger, and doubt. Again, Karen Kelsky in this passage here, she really is inviting people to transcend some conditioning that they might have undergone in their pursuit of an academic career. She's inviting them to feel things that they have resisted feeling over time. More from academia. And this is Jacqueline Hidalgo. She's a biblical scholar. She says, academic fields at large, but perhaps biblical studies especially, are circumscribed by a certain politics of reading, the acceptable canon of scholarly sources within any particular field, the authority that adheres to the reading of certain texts and not others, and the practices of authorization that surround and enable only certain ways of reading those texts. Again, there are bite elements at play here in what she's saying. Discourage individualism, encourage groupthink, minimize or discourage access to non-cult sources of information, including, books, articles, newspapers, magazines, media. Discourage access to critical information or former members. Now, here is another example from academia, and this is Lester Graby, and it's from an article that he wrote about consensus in academia. Consensus is something that scholars invoke to stop discussion a lot of times. They say, the consensus is this, therefore don't question it. Here's what he says, and he's a biblical scholar. He says, but what I have in mind is a general institutional mindset of the academy. This is to overvalue consensus. It can be subtle, slow, and ponderous, but before you know it, this relentless academic bulldozer has a way of grinding down new ideas, especially radical ones, and especially of crushing new scholars who may espouse radical ideas. Unfortunately, this process of bringing people to heel begins when we are students. You quickly learn which ideas are accepted, which are radical but harmless, and which are eccentric and can be laughed out of court. We learn that there are certain ideas you can ignore, but others you dare not challenge. As students, you are always conscious of where the consensus lay, or at least the point of view favored by your Doktorvater, which is your doctoral advisor. So what bite elements correspond to this? Well, discourage individualism, encourage groupthink, minimize access to non-cult sources of information, compartmentalize information into outsider versus insider doctrines, rejection of rational analysis, critical thinking, or constructive criticism, forbid critical questions about leader, doctrine, or policy allowed, labeling alternative belief systems as illegitimate, evil, or not useful. In this case, it would be something that's outside of the consensus position of scholars is illegitimate, right? And instill a new map of reality. Reality is determined by the consensus. More from academia. Here are some articles. Denial is not going to fix social psychology, and the replication crisis has spread through science. Can it be fixed? These are articles talking about the replication crisis in the social sciences and even in the hard sciences. This is a very serious problem in academia, in the sciences, because when you can't replicate the results of your research, it definitely invalidates your research. And that is a problem that has been widespread and ongoing for a long time. A lot of academic studies just don't replicate. A lot of even scientific studies are not replicating. And academics have gotten very, very creative in their rationalizations, trying to minimize this problem or dismiss it. And finally, there's an article about the hoax studies, the grievance studies scandal in critical theory, where several people submitted totally fake academic papers with completely falsified research, made up data, and several academic journals published these articles and praised them very highly. So a bite element that's relevant here is rejection of rational analysis, critical thinking, and constructive criticism. Now, in university life, we have these headlines from time to time of students shouting down visitors to campuses and even their professors and trying to cancel people. There are definitely bite elements that correspond to these behaviors, require members to internalize the group's doctrine as truth, adopting the group's map of reality as reality, instill black and white thinking, decide between good and evil, and organize people into us versus them, insiders versus outsiders. There's also rejection of rational analysis, critical thinking, constructive criticism, and so forth. And use of loaded language and cliches which constrict knowledge, stop critical thoughts, and reduce complexities into platitudinous buzzwords. When you're in a protest and you're shouting slogans and riling up the people around you with these slogans, that definitely fits that criterion from bite. Now let's talk about another example, and this one is from the military. Here you have an article that says the military is a cult, and this individual went through and exhaustively talked about how the military has all of these features of cults. And I'm saying there's too many bite components to list here. I would have to put the full bite model up here for comparison. This article is really thorough. Now, I'm going to pause here and say that the fact that you see a lot of bite elements in some area of human experience, like military service, does not mean that is a cult. And this is probably why a lot of academic researchers have kind of stepped away from the term, because when you're calling things like the military a cult, it becomes useless. The military, we have very, very broadly understood notions of how the military should operate. And that is with a lot of behavior control, a lot of information control, and so forth. Because the military has to have a lot of cohesion in order to function correctly. if you do not have a cohesive military, you cannot defend yourself. So again, the military is a classic example of where the term cult really kind of does become useless. And the ways that we think about what amounts to a cult, they really kind of become useless. Now let's talk about social justice activism. So here is an academic article, Unhappy Confessions, the Temptation of Admitting to White Privilege. And listen to this abstract. Admissions of white privilege and or racism are common among white anti-racists and others who want to combat their racism. In this article, I argue that because such admissions are conscious attempts to address unconscious habits, they are unhappy speech acts and contrary to their implied aims. Admissions of white privilege or racism can be conceptualized as Foucauldian confessions that are pleasurable to enact, but ultimately reinforce white people's feelings of goodness and allow them to avoid addressing this racism. I ground my argument in Shannon Sullivan's analysis of white privilege and Sarah Ahmed's critique of confessions of racism and privilege to show that in addition to doing no anti-racist work at the moment of saying, these confessions actually reify white privilege deeper into the unconscious and make it harder to address. And here you have an article called My Lived Experience with the Cult of Social Justice. Let's talk about BITE and how it applies to these. Promote feelings of guilt or unworthiness, such as identity guilt, or your affiliations are unwise, your thoughts, feelings, actions are irrelevant or selfish, or social guilt or historical guilt. Instill fear, such as fear of thinking independently, the outside world, enemies, losing one's salvation, or one's salvation from racism, in this case, leaving or being shunned by the group, or others' disapproval, or again, historical guilt. Extremes of emotional highs and lows, love bombing and praise one moment, and then declaring you are a horrible sinner. And again, rejection of rational analysis, critical thinking, or constructive criticism. Forbid critical questions about leader, doctrine, or policy aloud. Okay, so let's talk more about social justice activism. Here we have more articles. Social justice isn't a religion, it's an ugly cult. Excommunicate me from the cult of toxic social justice. And here's one, why liberal white women pay a lot of money to learn over dinner how they're racist. Again, those same elements of BITE apply here, but there's another one, ritualistic and sometimes public confession of sins. So that especially applies to this article of white women paying money to learn over dinner how they're racist. It's that culty compulsion. It's that cultish sense of obligation to be constantly confessing sins, right? That is what we're seeing according to the BITE model. And finally, another area of activism, and it's gender theory activism. So here's an article from Redux Mag talking about an 80-year-old woman who was banned from her local swimming pool for raising concerns about a male in the female washroom, and she was heckled as she gave a speech. The activists ripped down the suffragette flags behind her and tried to sabotage her microphone. Again, rejection of rational analysis, critical thinking, or constructive criticism. Forbid critical questions about the doctrine, right? And labeling alternative belief systems as illegitimate, evil, or not useful. In this case, the alternative belief system is the belief of this 80-year-old woman that an individual with male genitalia should not be in the women's washroom. And down below here, I have a video, and here is an interview where a man went onto a university campus. It looks like the University of Washington. And he started asking this question that has become kind of common, like, okay, what would you say if I tell you I'm a woman? And you can see all of them saying, well, okay, if that's what you feel like you are, then okay. Now, the fact that somebody is willing to say even that shows that they have been indoctrinated into a very, very powerful belief system that compels them to deny observable reality. But he went further in his questions and he said, what if I say I'm a Chinese woman? And then what if I say I'm a 6'5" Chinese woman? And you can see these individuals responding. And what are they doing? Well, they are enacting these thought-stopping techniques which shut down reality testing by stopping negative thoughts and allowing only positive thoughts, including denial, rationalization, justification, and wishful thinking. And use of loaded language. Again, I'm not going to read that whole one. But also encourage only good and proper thoughts. You can actually see these university students kind of the wheels turning in their heads. Oh, what is the proper thing to say here? Not what is true, not what is accurate, but I need to say the proper thing in response to these questions. These are definitely some very observable examples of elements of bite. So what can we reasonably conclude about bite? Well, elements of bite are found in a lot of different areas of human experience. And experiencing some combination of bite elements does not necessarily mean you are in a cult. It may mean that you are just in a high demand environment, and life is full of high demand environments. Society functions because of the existence of high demand environments. Now, people process high demand systems in different ways. Some people process high demand systems as healthy, well-adjusted adults. Other people do not. And it kind of depends on how much we have internalized kind of the core assumptions of the system or the mission of the system. I'll just from a personal example, my own mission was definitely a very high demand system. My missionary service, very high demand, very strict information control and behavior control and so forth. I loved my mission. Well, it was hard, but I'm profoundly grateful for my mission experience. And I would do it again. There's no question I would do it again. And I think the amount of structure that I experienced on the mission is the reason why I loved the experience so much. If my mission had been one where the rules were lax and people could kind of do whatever, I probably would have been homesick and frustrated much more than I was. So again, but there are other people who processed the experience differently. And that is true of other systems like the military, like academia, like activism, or the legal profession, or investment banking, or any number of very high demand systems. Okay, so let's talk about the church and bite. All right. Now, the starting point for any discussion of the church and bite is to recognize that Christianity has always been an extremely high demand system. So let's look at these passages from the New Testament. Matthew 7:21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name? And in your name cast out spirits, and in your name done many miracles. I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you lawbreakers. That is a very ominous kind of teaching. And I imagine the people who received it had some fear in response to it, of being among that group that is told, I never knew you, depart from me, right? Matthew 11:20, then he began to rebuke the cities in which the majority of his miracles had been done because they did not repent. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! If the miracles were done in Tyre and Sidon that were done among you, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I say to you that on the day of judgment it will be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? No, you will be brought down to Hades, because if the miracles were done in Sodom that were done among you, it would have remained to this day. But I say to you that it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom in the day of judgment than for you. Again, if I were one of the people around Christ when he spoke these things, I would have felt fear for those people and maybe for myself as well. Like, I need to be one of these people who really does commit to this system and doesn't fall away from it. Mark 9:43, and if your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. For it is better for you to go through life maimed than having two hands to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. For it is better to go through life maimed than having 2 feet to be cast into hell. And if your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out. For it is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than having 2 eyes to be cast into hell, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. Now, the word stumble here is talking about stumbling in our faith. If there's any influence in your life that causes you to stumble in your faith, you need to sever it. This very, very much corresponds to several components of bite. And finally, Luke 14:25, a large crowd came to him, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters and even his own life, he is not able to be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me is not able to be my disciple. Every one of you who does not forsake all that he has is not able to be my disciple. Now, if I stood up in a large auditorium full of people in our day and age and said that to people, people would call me a cult leader. There's no question about it. So foundationally, we need to understand that Christianity has always been extremely high demand. That is something that we can understand from the words of Jesus that he spoke to the people around him. Now let's talk about Bruce Tuckman's stages of group development. Bruce Tuckman was a researcher who in the 60s, he came up with this model of how groups work. And he said there are stages, and the first one is forming, and that's where the team comes together. And the next one is storming, where there's a lot of conflict and establishing order and hierarchies. And a lot of people there's a lot of turmoil here, and a lot of people leave the group during this time with hurt feelings and anger and frustration because they lost the power struggle during the storming phase. And here we see bite elements in efforts to bring order and cohesion to the group. While a group is still getting kind of its very basic operating rules together, we do see a lot of, again, turmoil and conflict. When we think about this, we can remember back to the Kirtland period in the history of the church, for example, and even going up through Nauvoo. That was definitely a storming period for the church. And then you have norming, where you get into a phase where people are working together more cooperatively, and then performing, where you're focused on more than anything, just execution of the group's objectives. Now, this is true of groups like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but also, groups like startups. I have a link here to an article that says, our startup totally isn't a cult. And the writer, she goes through kind of typical startup behavior, and it's sort of a satire, but kind of not. But talking about how, a technology startup company, they do things in those forming and storming stages, especially, that look culty and feel culty to people who participate in them. As groups evolve over time, in order to stay cohesive, in order to develop a coherent sense of mission and hierarchies that can actually govern the group over time, we definitely do see some elements of bite, and this is true of every organization. Now, like any organization, the church faces challenges related to cohesion and information control and inclusion exclusion. The church is not different from a lot of organizations in this regard. You have to have those things or the organization ceases to exist. Now, almost all organizations need to make hard choices in these areas or risk falling apart. Most organizational policies around cohesion, information control, and inclusion exclusion result in organizations being accused of cult behavior. Again, startups, investment banks, law firms, you name it, all kinds of organizations in doing these ordinary, necessary things to establish themselves, they do behave in ways that reflect elements of the bite model. And that's why people accuse them of being culty. Now, what are we doing well in the church? What are things that we are doing that are non-culty? Well, we have people living everywhere, interacting constantly with people of other belief systems. When we think about how cults operate, how they kind of isolate themselves to a compound or a geographic area and try to separate their members from the outside world. No, we are in the outside world. I spend vastly more time among people who are not of my faith than people who are of my faith. I have spent years of my life where I've actually gone more to other churches than going to mine. So we are everywhere. We are not isolated in a compound like you see with a lot of cults. At church schools, we study a wide variety of disciplines, including comparative religion. That's where I got my first exposure to Buddhism and Taoism and some other belief systems, right? It was in a church school at BYU. That's where I took a really great comparative religion course. We openly publish our handbook of church policy. That has been a really great development in recent years. We strive to help people become self-reliant. So rather than have an institution where we try to make sure that everybody is financially and emotionally and otherwise dependent upon the church for everything, we want people to be emotionally and intellectually and financially self-reliant. We want people to be able to take care of themselves and come to church actually being able to help because we have abundance. We're self-reliant. We can help other people. We honor and value God's light everywhere it is found. Here's a snippet from a church news article covering a talk given by President Oaks to, I believe it was to mission presidents. And it says, Latter-day Saints often refer to the church as the only true church. Sometimes it might be done in a way that gives offense to people who belong to other churches or subscribe to other philosophies. Ways that might imply arrogance, a holier-than-thou attitude, a monopoly on truth that excludes other faiths and philosophies, or suggestions that Latter-day Saints are better than others. We should try to avoid all of those ideas because none of them is true, President Oaks said. God has not taught us anything that should cause us to feel arrogant or superior to other people. 3 features make the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints the only true and living church upon the face of the whole earth: the fullness of his doctrine, the power of his priesthood, and a unique testimony of Jesus Christ. President Oaks here is saying, we do not claim to have all of the truth in the entire world. We have 3 very, very unique things to offer the world. And those are the things that comprise our claim that the church is what we claim it to be, the Church of Jesus Christ. But we do not claim that God is not also shining his light into other places in the world and blessing people however they are able to receive it. Well, what can we do? Yes, we will always be accused of being a cult. But even while dismissing stupid accusations, are there some things we can do better as a people? Sure. Let's talk about this. One of them is we can teach a healthy balance of internal and external authority. Now, I have a diagram here where we have kind of the extremes of external authority versus internal authority. And if all of my authority is external, in other words, I'm only ever looking to external sources to figure out what I think and feel, and for all of my convictions about the gospel, I'm going to be living on borrowed light. And it really is kind of a form of idolatry. I might end up worshiping church leaders, worshiping the church instead of the Christ who is at the head of the church, right? And at the other extreme, we have internal authority. So internal authority, when that's taken to an extreme, I'm basically just worshiping myself. And everything is relative. Everybody has their own internal authority and nothing really means anything. And along that spectrum, there are different ways of thinking. So at the extreme of external authority, people are going to say things like, when I have questions, I always defer to scripture or the opinions of other people. Why? Because they're not really seeking to know for themselves. They're not seeking understanding for themselves. It's just deferring to other people. Now, when somebody is not quite at the extreme, though, they might say, when I face a difficult problem or question, I usually defer to others, but I occasionally follow my own intuition. That means they have some internal authority. Now, at the other extreme of internal authority, we end up with basically self-worship and relativism. Just worshiping our own thoughts and feelings, never ever looking to any outside sources. And we end up thinking that everybody has their own internal authority, so everything's all relative. That's relativism. And we'll say things like, I never defer to anyone or anything that does not share my views. Or God always validates my views. If I'm at that extreme of self-worship, those are the kinds of things that I'm going to say. But if I lean towards internal authority, but I do defer sometimes to external authority, I might say things like this. I'm willing to defer to external authorities, but I expect them to have solid reasons that outweigh my own thoughts and perceptions. Now, that is often not helpful because we need to have some healthy skepticism of our own thoughts and perceptions. Otherwise, again, we just tend to think that we are infallible. Now, a healthy balance might sound like this. When I have questions, I privilege voices that have been revealed to me as ordained of God, but I balance those voices against my own intuition and other sources of information. When I find myself in disagreement with God's ordained servants, that becomes an opportunity for introspection and soul searching. Often, even with some reluctance, I defer to external authorities out of an awareness that I have my own gaps in understanding, and that external authorities may see more of the picture than I do. I know that God works in ways that often seem foolish to humanity, and I know that an essential part of a life of faith is obedience in the absence of complete understanding. Notice this is a very non-dogmatic statement. A lot of people might look at that and say it's too mushy or too squishy, too soft, but there are going to be times in our life of discipleship and in our relationship with the church where a church leader might say or do something that doesn't quite sit right with us. And how we respond to that is important. If I respond at the extreme of external authority, I'm just going to push back any possible thoughts or feelings that I have, push them down, stuff them down. And some people just do that for so long that they end up being a volcano that explodes in anger toward the church. If I come across something that a church leader says or does that doesn't sit quite well with me, and my extreme is at the internal extreme, I'm just going to wave it off, dismiss it, instead of really exploring it and saying, do I understand this the way I should? I might even decline to pray about it and fast about it and really work through it. I'm going to say this. I've had several of these situations, and I have been blessed by that process of really taking time, weighing what a church leader has said, really exploring it, asking for God's help in thinking through it in the healthiest possible way. Another thing that we can do is we can move away from fear-based religion. I love this quote from Elder Uchtdorf in General Conference. He said, "It is true that fear can have a powerful influence over our actions and behavior, but that influence tends to be temporary and shallow. Fear rarely has the power to change our hearts, and it will never transform us into people who love what is right and who want to obey Heavenly Father. People who are fearful may say and do the right things, but they do not feel the right things. They often feel helpless and resentful, even angry. Over time, these feelings lead to mistrust, defiance, even rebellion. Now remember, in the last slide, I talked about that problem of too much external authority and how sometimes people can just pretend to agree and they become a volcano that explodes over time. That's what Elder Uchtdorf is saying here. Unfortunately, this misguided approach to life and leadership is not limited to the secular world. It grieves me to hear of church members who exercise unrighteous dominion, whether in their homes, in their church callings, at work, or in their daily interactions with others. We really, really would benefit from transitioning away from fear-based religion. If my religion is not one of love and joy and growth, I can't really fake that. One of the ways that we try to compensate when our religion is not a religion of faith and joy and growth is we settle for fear-based religion and conformity and those kinds of things. And that becomes our religious disposition. Elder Uchtdorf is telling us that's not healthy. We really can and must do better. I agree with him. Now, what are some other things that we can do? We can respect people's decisions. If somebody loses their faith and they end up leaving the church, we can just respect that and not hound them or persecute them in any way. We should never do that. We should really respect conclusions that people come to, right? Now, that said, parent-child situations do require control. But to whatever extent possible, that should be through loving and inviting influence. It's totally, totally acceptable for a parent of a child to say, while you live under my roof, you go to church. You do this, that. That is normal parenting. It's healthy parenting. It's good parenting. So we should never, ever be ashamed to require that our kids participate in church activities while they live under our roof. Now, I say to whatever extent possible, that should be through loving, inviting influence. Parenting is a really challenging thing because I also know of situations where kids have really gone off the rails in a number of ways, and parents have had to intervene in ways that impose a lot of control on their kids so that their kids don't end up in jail or hurt in some way. So some amount of control over our kids is healthy. We shouldn't just indulge everything that they want and everything that they think and feel. That is not healthy parenting. Now, sort of related to that is we can strive to help people make commitments that correspond to their level of conversion. Now, this entire spectrum here represents our obedience and compliance. All of us have some amount of obedience and compliance with the restored gospel as we understand it, and with the church's directives and policies and so forth. Some of that obedience and compliance is motivated by real conversion. There are principles that I'm converted to. That means they are written on my heart. They're not hard for me to obey because I have really internalized the value of those principles. Now, some amount of our obedience and compliance are motivated not necessarily by conversion, but by expectations and trust. The idea with our gospel living is that we live in some amount of expectations and trust, and over time, we will internalize those principles from our obedience and become more and more converted. So this green section of the spectrum will expand, the red section of the spectrum will decrease. And the ideal is we are converted to all of the gospel, right? That is not going to happen probably to any of us in our entire lifetime, but we want to develop as much authentic conversion as possible. When people are too committed, too far beyond their real level of conversion for too long, we tend to fall apart when that happens. It tends to feel oppressive, and a lot of people who come out of those situations say, oh, it felt like I was in a cult, right? Whereas somebody who was converted to those principles experienced it completely differently. They felt energized by those commitments. They felt more joy and happiness in keeping those commitments. And finally, we can teach critical thinking skills and epistemology. And I have 2 presentations that I've done on these. Why is this important? Well, when we teach critical thinking skills, that is a blessing to the people who we teach. If somebody has critical thinking skills, they can really critically examine the gospel and also criticisms of the gospel. And they can make that soul level choice to live the gospel. We can teach critical thinking and epistemology in ways that allow people to really see their choices with a lot more clarity than just going by external authorities throughout their whole life. And then at some point saying, oh gosh, this feels like a cult, right? If we have good awareness of these concepts, that is very helpful in experiencing the gospel in a way that doesn't feel like a cult. It feels like a very well-informed soul-level decision that balances our heart, our mind, our intuitions, and our experiences, and so forth. So my hope is that we can do things like this as a church that really steer us away from bite behaviors to whatever extent possible. But I also understand that there's no way we're ever going to not be accused of being a cult. If someone has decided that we're a cult, they are probably not going to be open to applying critical thinking to their own assumptions that underlie that accusation. And we just need to understand that that is something we're going to have to live with. But we can live happily. We can apply the gospel in ways that we thrive and feel energized by it. Thank you for joining me for this discussion. This has been an episode of Latter-day Presentations. We would like to remind viewers that our channel represents our own views and not necessarily any official positions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We hope this presentation has been informative. Our notes for this show are at Nauvoo Neighbor, and the link can be found in the show description. Also in the show description, we have a link to provide feedback. If you would like to suggest a topic for discussion, or if you would like to contribute a presentation on a topic of interest to you, let us know. Thanks again for joining us.